Graphing hyperbolas. To graph horizontal hyperbolas, we will be graphing the equation x minus h quantity squared over a squared minus y minus k squared over b squared equals 1. So we're going to have our center somewhere. Now, keep in mind the center is not always going to be on 0, 0, but in this case it is. But this is going to be our center point. And then we're going to have our vertice points. So our vertice points are going to be like somewhere out here. It doesn't really matter where they are, but they're going to be somewhere out here depending on what our a squared is. So those are going to be our vertice points. And that's going to be a distance from C. So that's how we find C, or how we find our A. We use our A to find where our vertices are. And then we have our focus points, which are going to be further in, depending on what our C is. And we just have to remember that C squared equals A squared plus B squared. So that's how we find our focus points. And then the B will help us to draw our asymptotes, so we'll do that in a minute. But the next thing we want to do is actually we can draw our curves now. They look like parabolas, and they're just going to kind of go like and go out. But sometimes it's easiest if we draw our asymptotes first. So that's what it looks like. But if we draw our asymptotes first, like I said, that's going to correspond to our B, so that's going to go up. So this distance right here would be our B, or we would have this distance right here. That's our B. Okay, now if we want to actually draw our asymptotes and draw a more exact graph, we can draw a little box between our A, or our vertices, and our co-vertices. And then just draw a line through them. So this line right here and this line right here are our asymptote lines. And they go through the corners of the box and the center of the hyperbola. And what that essentially means is that our graph instead of curving like that, our graph would be a little bit flatter, and it's going to curve out to near but not actually touching our asymptotes. So that's what our graph would actually look like. Horizontal hyperbola. Vertical hyperbolas are similar, except for the fact that it's y minus k quantity squared over a squared minus x minus h quantity squared over b squared equals 1. So my center is still going to be marked the same way. You mark your center, and then we mark our vertices based on our a, but because the a is with the y this time, our vertices are going to change on the y. So that's going to be my vertice, and then there's my other vertice. And then we're going to curve away up and down on that. And then my focus points are going to be somewhere in here. I don't know exactly where they'll be, but you'll figure that out with regards to your C squared equals A squared plus B squared, same as it was on the other one. And then the next thing we want to do is find our B, because if we can find our B, then we can easily graph our asymptotes and then make an exact graph of the hyperbola. So if my B is like here, if it works out that my B comes to be here, then those would be my co-vertices, and I can draw a little box between those. and then draw my asymptotes right here through the corners of the box and the center of the hyperbola. And then my final step should be to actually graph the hyperbola. So it's going to approach but never actually reach that asymptote line, and there we go, on both ends. And it's going to curve around my focus point. There you go. So here's some examples of graphing hyperbolas. With this one we see x minus 2 quantity squared over 4 minus y minus 2 quantity squared over 5 equals 1. So my center is going to be 2, 2. So I'm going to go ahead and graph my center right there. And then my vertices have to do, it's horizontal because my x is first, so I know I'm going to change my x. So I'm going to take 2 plus or minus my a. My a is the square root of 4. Which is 2. So plus or minus 2 comma 2. So that would make it 0, 2, and 4, 0. Or sorry, 4, 2. So those are my two vertices. And if I wanted to find my co-vertices to help us draw our asymptote lines, then we would need to find our b. So b is going to be the square root of 5, which is not exact, so we want to round this one just to get a rough estimate. And we would get roughly 2.23. It's got to be a little bit more than a square root of 4. So we have about right here, count about 2.23 up from the center and 2.23 down from the center. And then if we draw a box between those, then my asymptotes are right there. Through the center and through the corners. And then I can actually sketch my actual graph, which is going to be through the vertices and get closer and closer to the asymptotes but never touch. The last thing we need to do is find our focus, because we need to graph our focus as well. So to find our focus, we take c squared equals a squared plus b squared. So c squared equals 4 plus 5. So it's 3. And the same thing changes for the focus as changes in the vertices. So it's going to be 2 plus or minus 3 comma 2. So that's going to make it 5, 2 or negative 1, 2. And those would be our focus points. And that's your graph. This next example, we have y squared over 4 minus x plus 1 quantity squared over 3 equals 1. So in this case, our center, let's mark that first, is negative 1 comma 0. So I'll mark that. And then my vertices are going to correspond to my a, which is with the y this time, so it's negative 1, and then it's going to be 0 plus or minus my a, and my a is the square root of 4, which is 2, so plus or minus 2, and that's going to be with the y, so it's going to come up here to negative 1, 2, and down to here, negative 1, negative 2, so those are my vertice points. Then I'm going to go ahead and mark my co-vertices, which correspond to my b. b is going to be equal to the square root of 3, which is roughly equal to 1.73. So I'm going to mark that. count from the center 1.73. So about there, and then I'm going to go ahead and draw the box around those so I can graph my asymptote lines. And then my asymptotes go through the center and through the corners. And then if I actually graph the equation, going to approach my asymptotes but never reach them. And then finally, I want to indicate where my focus points are. My focus points are going to be matched up with my c. C squared equals a squared plus b squared. So c squared equals 4 plus 3. Take a square root. So c equals the square root of 7, which is roughly equal to about 2.6, 65 if you want to be a little more exact. So my focus points are going to be down from the center, 2.65, about there, and about there. So those are my focus points, and there's your vertical hyperbola. Those are your notes over graphing hyperbolas. You should now know how to create the equations of hyperbolas and find all the important parts of hyperbolas and then graph those important parts of hyperbolas. Go through the practice problems and then you should be ready for your quiz over hyperbolas.